Capital is abundant. Understanding is scarce. The Dynamo Show goes deep with the new industrialists rejuvenating industry and commerce. Brought to you by Dynamo Ventures. Learn more at dynamo.vc/podcast. Now, here's your host, Madelyn O'Farrell.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Dynamo Show. I'm your host, Madelyn O'Farrell, and I'm excited to be joined today by Scott Friedman, VP of Government Affairs at Altana. Scott, thanks for being here.
Pleasure to be on. Thanks for having me.
I'd love to just start with your personal journey. Can you walk us through maybe what took you from building trade enforcement policy for government to actually building the technology to enforce it?
Yeah, sure. I joke and say that Altana is the technological expression of my policy interest. I was very fortunate to have had the opportunity to serve in government at a time when the narrative around trade, around geoeconomics, around what national power through the lens of economic capacity meant. And it was an interesting time. It was work that was compelling and I thought was extraordinarily meaningful, but it certainly wasn't finished. And I think it won't be finished for a long time. And so when I left government, I didn't want to totally depart that policy area. And I wanted to, if I could, find a place where I could continue to materially influence the types of activities that I thought were going to be impactful to accomplish some of those policy goals. And a big part of that was I thought, and I continue to think, there was just a data element, an element of better information that we were lacking in government and the world was lacking writ large. And so I was very fortunate to find the company I'm at now and to find my now CEO, Evan Smith, who I just got along with on an ideological level, on an intellectual level. And we kind of came to the conclusion that the geoeconomic picture was challenged and was going to remain to be challenged for some period of time. And he convinced me that the work that he had started and was building at Altana was a big part of how we could solve that. And I came to the same opinion. And now I'm here. And I think that the work we are doing will, materially contribute to a part of that much bigger policy conversation.
Amazing. Love that journey. One of your interesting takes is that America was in part founded on a customs dispute, effectively who gets to govern trade. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Well, that's right. I mean, we'll all be familiar with the Boston Tea Party. And that was part of the Tea Act. That was part of a broader taxation scheme that was levied on the American colonies by the British government vis-a-vis customs duties. And what I meant by that was it was to orient people to a discussion that's been going on for hundreds of years, and in fact, far longer than the United States has been a country, but that the mechanisms by which state powers exercise their authority at the border, and in this case, their authority over the cost of moving goods across the border, is as old as time. And is not necessarily something that we should be surprised that it's happening again. Maybe it's surprising that it's happening in the period that we're living. But the point of that comment was to say, listen, people, not only is this not new, it's not new to America. And that this is something that is at the core of the American experience. It's at the core of the way that Americans view the world and the way that state power is exercised. It was used in a manner that we did not appreciate, but there was a lot of logic to it if you kind of flip the map around and take it from the other side. And if those kind of geopolitical dynamics could have played out 250 years ago, it's unreasonable for us to believe that they wouldn't play out again. And in this case, maybe we'll be the ones that are be exercising that power.
What do you think that framing means for the current moment around trade enforcement? And is there any difference between what we're experiencing today and every other time that trade enforcement has been in the headlines?
Well, it's certainly different now, as I alluded to, because it's probably the first time in most people's living lifetime in the United States, that trade has been a mechanism of state power and been used in that way. For the preponderance of most people's lived realities, we've lived in an era of free trade, with this idea that trade impediments were antithetical not only to the American experience, but to the prosperity of the United States and the kind of Western capitalist world. And for a lot of good reason. I mean, if you look at kind of from the 1950s onward, liberal application of free trade has brought about enormous benefits and enormous wealth. But that was operated on the auspice that everyone was going to continue to play by the rules of the game as they were constructed. And in a largely, at least economically speaking, unipolar world. The framing of this idea that, the current trade paradigm is a different moment from every other trade time, or every other time and that maybe we've experienced, is that for the first time, the United States, which is kind of the high priests of free trade, are reevaluating the efficacy of that belief and are not exclusively using the incredible military strength as the sole mechanism for coercive state power. Certainly not in the ways that kind of cause these major reciprocal responses. You could argue that, we've had the ability to incentivize action vis-a-vis our dominance of the financial system for a long time. But modulating trade or putting stipulations on trade, especially as the biggest economy in the world, is a fundamentally different thing. And we can kind of talk about the efficacy of that later, but you have to admit that seismic shift and the speed in which that shift happened, not necessarily just in this administration, right? It was extremely abrupt in the second Trump administration, but it really started in the first Trump administration and carried through to now. And by any measure, that's a very short amount of time for such, meaningful changes to the way the global order works.
To that point around, trade being used as a mechanism for state power, an obvious example of that is kind of the IEEPA tariffs and the volatility that we've experienced kind of on the importer and exporter side over the last, call it 18 months. You have an interesting perspective, having sat on kind of both sides of the table there, from inside government to now outside of it. What do you think the gap is between what regulators are demanding and what importers and exporters can actually execute?
Yeah. Well, I think you have to put the regulator in the middle of that equation, because in fact, what you have policymakers on the one side that are enacting policy adjustments for an objective, right? For a macro policy objective. The trade are the respondents to that, and they have to figure out how to navigate that new paradigm. And then the regulators are kind of in the middle to interpret those policy objectives, those decrees, and somehow figure out how they're going to execute them in a way that the trade can and should respond. And so, I think the gap that we see, and we've seen this, kind of play out a couple of times now in various cases, whether it be through legislation or tariffs or, non-tariff barrier determinations, trade barrier determinations, is that the policy objectives are pretty clear. Policymakers kind of know why they're steering the ship that way. It's the speed at which they want to turn the wheel, I think, is the real challenge. It's the way that change is communicated has been a challenge, right? We've seen the private sector respond over time, given the opportunity. But when the wheel, kind of rapidly moves one way or another, they don't have the ability, especially large multinational corporations, really don't have the ability to make those adaptations as fast as, I think policymakers would want. And the regulators are sort of caught in the middle because they are having to, in hyperspeed, interpret, okay, what does this mean? Think through legacy structures and rules and statute, right? Existing laws, and then be able to come up with something that they can then put to the trade so that there is a new mechanism of dialogue between, the regulator and the regulated. And, I think no one will be surprised that my answer to this question would be, the real deficiency here is a lack of technology and a lack of forethought into the way that legacy systems have been contemplated for their utility, both not only to address the policy issues of today, but also to create a flexible and agile basis to continue to be usable and adaptable for whatever comes next. Because we are certainly not at the end of this. And in many cases, we're probably just at the very beginning. So that's what I think is probably the biggest gap that we see today, is that the regulators are having a really difficult time onboarding and integrating, novel capabilities that will allow them to do what they need to do now, but also put them on a front foot, forward-leaning posture to be able to exercise and enable the requirements of the future.
And I think that point you make on technology is a great segue into talking about the work that you all are doing at Altana. I've got some specific questions for you around the products that you're building and such, but just for our listeners' sake, could you maybe catch them up to speed at the high level of what Altana is building?
Yeah, sure thing. So at the kind of highest level, we are trying to structure a mechanism to enable a more useful, trusted, transparent mechanism for global trade. We believe that transaction, which happens every day, which has happened for time immemorial, that there is an importer, there is a mechanism to disclose what's happening, and then there is the receipt of that, and then there is a determination that closes the loop, is something that is ripe for technological improvement, and in fact can enable and enhance the roles, responsibilities, and requirements on each person in that chain. And that's from the importer, that's brokers, that's the regulator, that's folks that are moving the goods themselves. All of this depends on some level of fidelity of information to move rapidly across that chain. And we started with this idea that supply chain visibility was critical. That was a conclusion I think most of the world came to around COVID. We then kind of realized that if you are unable to transact, do anything with that information, simply identifying hot spots or cold spots, good or bad, kind of in that illuminated view, only takes you so far. But what the world really wants is they want to be able to do something, right? They want to be able to transact. They want to execute processes that they are already doing, the things that actually make the world go from a commercial standpoint. And that increased level of insight could materially help that. And so we went on that journey, and where we are on that journey now, which is the recent stop, and it certainly won't be the last, but is the most exciting bit we're at the moment, is how do we enable that transaction? How do we help that policymaker achieve those objectives, arm the regulator with the tools that they need to be able to rapidly execute what they need to do, and in doing so, give the private sector the mechanism to comply, but do it in a way that meets the need without introducing friction, so that there is this very efficient and virtuous loop of process that in fact makes everybody better, doesn't impede the entire process by virtue of the fact that we are asking relatively more of everybody involved. That's just the world we're in. And so that's what we're working on.
And my understanding is that one of the key ways Altana does this is through product passports, which I believe you've likened to kind of a global entry for goods. Can you tell us a little bit more about what those are and how that logic applies of moving travelers to moving goods at scale?
Yeah, sure thing. Well, the first thing is, as a former policymaker, right, we don't ever try to make up anything new. If somebody's got a good idea that worked, we should try and use that as a jump off point, at the very least, if not outright copy it. And so, this idea of global entry for goods rather, also for good, but for goods, it just borrows the paradigm of travelers entering the United States. If we take that step back and we imagine, why would anybody want to do business with the United States? Why does this matter? What is the incentive to comply with these things? Well, it's because there's a tremendous market here. In the case of goods, we're still the largest import market in the world. In the case of people, we were still a highly desirable place to come to for a litany of reasons. And so in the people paradigm and post 9/11, we decided that there was going to be a security threshold. We said that if you wanted to come to the country as a sender country, right, as a port of embarkation, you are going to have to comply by certain security criteria, the same ones that we imposed on ourselves, and say it is a privilege to come into the United States. To be able to take advantage of that privilege, we require you to screen passengers at a certain level, to use certain equipment, and we have the right to audit and make sure that you're continually doing that, right? That you're meeting that threshold. That's the safety that we need and that we require. And so that's what we did. And so the United States went out there and they said, these are the standards, go buy equipment from that marketplace. We don't care, but go screen people. And if you do all that stuff, then we will provide you with the relative benefit of, being able to come into the United States. And in years past that, when countries demonstrated that they could meet those requirements, we'll give you an additional benefit. We'll screen people in your country, we'll pre-clear them, and as soon as they land, they can go about their business, go wherever they want. And this has been a tremendous success. Abu Dhabi is a great example of this in the UAE. When they managed to get their pre-clearance program in the Abu Dhabi airport, every single one of those flights, was full and has been full for years. So there was a clear incentive alignment between those that wanted to take advantage of the market and the regulator who was trying to make sure that there was a certain threshold of security that was established. The same paradigm can be true for goods. And that's what we have sought to create with product passports, which is this idea that in 2026, if you import a product, and that is really the atomic unit, which is a big change from what we've thought about previously, right? Customs declarations today are done on shipments, but shipments don't necessarily tell the story of the thing, the product. That's in fact what we care about, because we care about what it's made of. We care about where it came from. We care about how it was made. All of that more detailed information that is now a requirement, and increasingly going to be so, requires another level of scrutiny. But that level of scrutiny can be challenging, and it can be, at this juncture anyway, questionable whether it's worth the effort. And so this idea of a product passport, which is a digital asset that the private sector could levy to provide relatively more information around an imported good, so that the regulator could get that information ahead of time and they could see that level of detail that they now require, would also, in a reciprocal manner, be able to provide them with a pre-validation benefit. To say, thank you, you've met a standard, you've kind of gone above and beyond what is currently required, because we may or may not ask you, and in certain cases, it's likely that we will. So to alleviate the logistical burden, the administrative burden, the actual delay that you might incur, if you provide this type of data, we will be able to provide you with some kind of benefit. And that's a change in the paradigm. And that mechanism by which we kind of borrowed this concept from the physical movement of people, and could we apply that to the much larger market of goods, is a novel concept, but one that we're very proud to say that we are slowly but surely introducing to both the regulator and the regulated. And we're trying to help them on that journey of what the future could and should look like. And the product passport is kind of at the core of that.
Incredibly helpful. And I'd love to dig a bit deeper into how Altana is tackling this opportunity. My understanding is Altana makes an interesting architectural bet with a federated approach to its network model. What exactly does that mean, and why did Altana take that approach?
Yeah. Well, it's because we didn't believe that anybody was going to trust anybody else. The customs paradigm has historically been an adversarial one, hence my comments at the top, right? Nobody wants somebody else telling them, you're going to pay me a fee for something coming across this border. Nor do they want to be in a situation where they're in an enforcement paradigm, right? Where they could be, kind of held up for the perception of the reality of a wrongdoing. Understanding that no one was going to voluntarily share anything with each other. Certainly they weren't going to commingle information for some egalitarian sense of, well, we should just do it for the sake of doing it because it's good or better. We had to create a structure that ensured that everybody had their own information in a safe and secure enclave that was unique and secure to them, while simultaneously establishing the rails, if you will, for information to be shared easily and with a common operating picture. I talked about that, approach of let's create a data fabric, let's create that illumination layer. Well, illumination, that visibility, has a dual benefit of also normalizing the picture that everybody's looking at, right? It's the same way that if you and I looked at a map together, we were seeing the same set of information oriented in the same way at the same time. That's extraordinarily important when we're talking about, data elements and data assets, especially ones that move around the world. We have to have a level of trust between us at the data level. And so that was what that federation was. It was a way to incentivize people to contribute, to participate, while not immediately exposing them to a counterparty that they may or may not actually want to work with. And so incrementally, bit by bit, we've demonstrated that this capability is both privacy and security preserving while also trust building. And it's that foundation that we're now stepping upon and building upon to enable these kind of transactional activities and outcomes. And in doing so, we've, slowly but surely been able to drag parties that were at opposite sides of the table towards one another and say, listen, we're not going to fix this thing overnight. We're not going to fundamentally change the way we've done business for 250 years overnight, but there are elements that we have to and need to work on, and let's try it leveraging this novel technological approach, which nobody in the world has ever been able to make happen before. That is the reason we took the bet. It's been a journey. It continues to be a journey, but it's working, and we're very proud to say that we are enabling people in a way that was never possible.
How does that tie into China's role in this geopolitical mess, if you will?
Yeah.
I have read that China has kind of a state-directed architecture for monitoring multinational supply chains, and the purpose is really to identify when those corporations are moving their supply chains away from China, which is, of course, kind of a concerted effort that most Western, particularly US companies, are currently undergoing. And so what is Altana's role in kind of ensuring that that global data is safe, secure? How do you think about, China's role as a structural challenge?
That's a great question. And I think it's, it allows us to step up a level in altitude and kind of think about this. Why does any of this matter? Why are we doing this in the first place? Who cares about customs or, trade processes? Well, because in every one of our systems, there is a reflection of our society. And there is a reflection of the way that we expect business to be conducted, because it's the way that we want our society to function. And in the United States, and I think broadly in the West, there is a desire for transparency, because transparency equals trust. And just like I told you, we had that federated system where we assumed no one would trust each other. And so we had to create a mechanism so that they could transparently work amongst each other if they chose to. That paradigm is at the heart of our system. It's this idea that I'm not going to do anything with you, and I'm not going to participate in this system unless I trust that it's fair and equal and that I'm going to be treated as such. The challenge that we have today with the scale and the speed and the complexity of the world is that we now find ourselves in many ways in these kind of false trade-offs, where this idea of transparency and trust is equated to inefficiency. And that the idea that a regulator may ask for more information because they are enforcing, in the case of forced labor, right? Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. That was a law of the land. It was passed in the United States to ensure that forced labor from a province in China was not part of the goods that were imported in the country. I think everyone could agree that that is a good and moral thing to do. The regulator is tasked with figuring out how to do that, and it is inconvenient for sure, but it is a reflection of the United States and the way in which we want to conduct ourselves and have businesses conduct themselves. But the idea that that introduces friction also introduces the challenge. And so the Chinese have a very different perspective, not only in the way that they view their society and the way they view the world and the way it should operate, the role of businesses in the world and how they should be responded to those requirements, those stipulations. And their perspective is they are the largest export market in the world. And they have the incredible ability to manufacture and distribute and export all manner of goods throughout the world. Their society depends upon that. And they want to do it quickly and they want to do it efficiently. And it is very clear now that they want to do it without anybody asking any questions about how they are doing it. And so the system, and they are expert system makers, and this is true across the spectrum, whether it be standard setting or whether it be componentry or whether it be an actual kind of manufacturing, they're excellent system makers. It is clear that they have seen the way the world is going, and they have come to a very similar conclusion that the systems, the technology, the requirements that countries are going to place vis-a-vis the authorities that they have, in this case, customs, will materially impact the way that the business community conducts business and how they conduct business. And so in a manner by which is, kind of classically Chinese, they have created this end-to-end digital trade ecosystem that has everything from physical hardware elements throughout the world to non-governmental organizations that are providing services and capabilities to data and standard technological benchmarks and standard activities to set up a reverse paradigm, which is instead of transparent and trusted, we want to be opaque but fast. Don't ask too many questions about this, but if you subscribe to our system, you subscribe to our tech stack through this myriad of both public and private sector market actors, you'll get everything you need. Small businesses can participate. You'll get a flow of goods. You'll get whatever information you need, but it will all be taken care of centrally by us. And that's the way we will solve these problems. There is certainly a conversation to be had about the merits of those systems. And, if we're looking from a pure efficiency standpoint and a commercial upside standpoint, it's easy to understand why, if you sit around the world, a Chinese system may be very compelling to you. But if we also agree that we are in the early stages of this larger geoeconomic competition, establishing the principles of opacity and no methods of control to check or to incentivize participation in good business conduct that's reflective of law and order or democratic values, then we're probably putting ourselves on a trajectory that will lead us to a place, at least as the United States, we don't want to be. And if you look at the laws that are being passed in Europe, probably the broader Western world. So it's a very complicated question. It's certainly one that we'll have to look at closely for many years. But I would also say that it's probably the flashpoint in this broader U.S.-China competition, and one that very few people appreciate, because it's the thing that enables global commerce, but it is also probably the least visible element of where the U.S. and China are coming apart and how the relative influence is going to permeate not only the politics of the world, but also the private sectors of the world.
Absolutely fascinating. Appreciate your perspective there. And I want to pull the thread a little bit on that US and EU kind of framework for transparency. As you mentioned, there's a number of laws being passed in both geographies around traceability and such. What's your perspective there? Is there enough of a shared framework for importers and exporters to use, or are they taking two very different approaches that are adding meaningful complexity?
Yeah, it's a fascinating time in the customs world for this for the reasons that you've set up very well. For the first time in its history, the European Union now has a central customs authority, EU Customs Authority in Lille, France, that was, created by legislation last June and was actually established just a couple months ago. That federalization of this very impactful tool of national power is a sea change in the trajectory of the European Union. And what makes it even more remarkable is that concurrent to that, they are imagining, and they are in fact starting to move out on an entirely digital and centralized customs ecosystem, the so-called EU Central Customs Data Hub, which will be at the core of whatever comes next. And why are they doing this? Well, they're doing this, of course, as a mechanism to execute national policy. Now, national policy at the EU level is an interesting one, right? Because there's 27 member states, and there is this kind of dance between what's delegated authority, what's going to be done at the EU level. And so there's this moment of almost federalization that happened when they went to the EU, when they went to the euro, and I would argue probably has not happened to the same degree since. So it's highly impactful. And when you look at the things that they are trying to do, they are removing de minimis, right? So this low value shipment, which has already happened in the United States. They're looking to leverage certain tariffs in certain goods, which has already happened in the United States. They are seeking a trust and check program, very similar to what we talked about, which is this idea that if you disclose relatively more information, do you get some kind of importation benefit? This idea of potentially a global entry for goods type paradigm. So from a policy standpoint, there seems to be a significant amount of alignment. From a political standpoint, obviously the United States and Europe are in a very challenging place. And this runs the gamut, but all of these things are interconnected. So it, all matters, whether it be defense, whether it be the technology conversation, whether it be, subsect of AI or data or privacy, whatever that might, play out as. And then there's the broader conversation about, these are two different markets that have very specific rules and in fact didn't have trade alignment in every way. And that was many of the grievances that have been called out by the Trump administration, the so-called, we have free and fair trade, but in fact it wasn't so free and fair. And that was something that the Trump administration took umbrage with and executed trade remedies against the European Union as a result, which of course had reciprocal impacts from a political standpoint. And so it is almost as if we're, two planets kind of orbiting each other, but not touching. We seem to be in the same universe. We seem to be talking about the same things. I think it very much remains to be seen whether we manage to align and harmonize these activities so that at worst, we are operating off of the same perspective and we're going to be, creating the same structures. And at best, there's obviously some harmonization in the way that these two systems can and will operate. Because the tragedy here is that if we get this wrong, the entities that will be penalized are, the corporations, the same corporations that both sides really want to see succeed and make it easy to operate within these markets. And again, if we take a step back and we think about it at the geopolitical level, it would seem insane that there would not be some type of alignment between the US and the EU, especially in the context of everything I just said about China, who both sides have clear issues with and are enacting policy, economic policy and trade policy explicitly to defend against, mass as a quantity all of its own. And the seeds are there for, a generational alignment that will create a new status quo. Whether the politics will allow for it or not, I don't think anybody knows, but it will be something that people like me, I think, will be engaged in for the rest of our lives, probably.
Fair enough. And I think the analogy of two planets seemingly in the same universe is a very well put one. Scott, I have one last question for you. For an importer that's trying to understand what end-to-end traceability really means, what's kind of the minimum viable version of visibility that they need in order to survive in the current enforcement environment?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think there's really a minimum viable anymore. I think there is just, the standard by which everyone is going to be held to. It's just whether, your ticket has been pulled out of the hat yet or not. And that's full traceability. The technology, the tools, the data mechanisms exist now to be able to do that diligence, to be able to ascertain who you're working with, on what product, to the value, to the nth degree of the value chain. And I'm not saying that, you can get there overnight in every case, but these are data assets that you can establish, you can build, you can refine, and you can maintain over time. And that's going to get you there. And it's going to get you there pretty quickly. And the regulators around the world are waking up to that fact. They are educating themselves in the same way that corporations are educating themselves. So this idea that you can just kind of bury your head in the sand and say, hey, too hard, too expensive, not precise enough. Those excuses, are not flying the same way that they used to. And in many cases, the pendulum has shifted. Sophisticated organizations with major cross-borders exposure are seeing it now not as I'm going to put my head in the sand, I'm going to dig my heels and say, no, not going to share, not going to disclose. They're saying, actually, if I get ahead of this, not only do I get to kind of, get the reputational benefit, I get the operational benefit, the comparative advantage benefit, but also I get to have the conversation with the regulator about what the future looks like. And I think that's probably the most important one there, is that there is always going to be some manner of enforcement discretion. And what we are seeing and what we're hearing is that the entities that show up with their best effort are in a materially better place than ones that are just going to the mat saying, well, I'll see you in court. This administration in particular has taken a very muscular view on that. And they are, not to say that they didn't know they had them, but they are reminding themselves of all of the enforcement tools and authorities that they have. And so companies, corporations that are leaning into technology first, data-based, dynamic posture, even if it's not perfect, even if they know it's not going to be perfect some amount of time, but can articulate what they're doing, why they're doing it, and the deficiencies they have in their system, and what they think they're going to need to do to get to that level of fidelity over time, are in really, really good shape. And the reality is, as I've said over and over again, we are in the early innings of this. This world is going to get more complicated. It's going to get more precise, and it's going to get more demanding. It's not going to go the other way. I often cite when we talk about tariffs, people say, "Oh, well, the tariffs are going to, this is a flash in the pan. They're going to go away." And, or, they're going to get. When Gina Raimondo was Secretary of Commerce, one of the last speeches she gave was at the Reagan National Economic Forum. And during that speech, she was talking about issuing 232 tariffs on semiconductors and how that was probably something that needed to happen. So there is a bipartisan view in the United States about the necessity of these economic security measures. That all falls on customs and trade enforcement as an operational layer. That same perspective is being arrived at in various places around the world. And the question becomes then, obviously, how quickly are those jurisdictions going to get to an operational posture where they can enact them? And how are those things going to harmonize, or not, unfortunately, over some period of time? And unfortunately, what that means for the trade is that they are going to have to do this one way or another. So the sooner they start, the better off they're going to be.
And I think that's a great lesson to end on. Scott, thank you so much for all of your insight today.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And to our Dynamo Show listeners, thank you as always for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a 5-star review and tell us what you liked. And be sure to head over to podcast.dynamo.vc to keep up to date with our latest content, or subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice. Until next time.